front line is here. Can you hold it?
We can, sir. We will.
Arrived in the dead of night, its words colder than any winter wind. Don't come back alive. Captain James Jimmy Callahan stared at the flickering lamp in the small tent, the paper trembling slightly in his calloused hands. His chest tightened as if the ink itself were a weight pressing against his heart. Outside, the Pacific jungle lay quiet, deceptively serene, with shadows of palm fronds dancing across the mud-smeared ground. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of artillery hinted that war never slept even when the night seemed endless. Jimmy's fingers traced the words again, unwilling to believe that they were meant literally. Don't come back alive. His mind struggled to reconcile the tone with the man who had signed the order, General Douglas MacArthur, the Supreme Commander of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. MacArthur, revered for his tactical genius, rarely issued direct orders to men in the field. Yet here it was, cold, precise, and seemingly impossible. He sank onto a wooden crate, the sound of his boots scraping against the wet ground echoing softly. His thoughts drifted. His brother Tommy, barely 20, had written him 2 months ago from the front lines. Keep your head down, Jimmy. You're the one with the brains in this family. Don't get yourself killed. Tommy's words now felt like a cruel irony. Jimmy knew what the general expected of him. This mission wasn't just dangerous, it was essentially a death sentence. He could feel the eyes of the other pilots on him, even though none were in the tent. They would know soon enough. Jimmy had been selected for a mission that no one else could attempt. Deep reconnaissance over Japanese-occupied territory in the Philippines, a region teeming with enemy fortifications, anti-aircraft guns, and thousands of trained soldiers. Failure meant death. Survival meant not returning. The contradiction gnawed at him. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel. From the nearby runway, engines hummed, low and constant, like a heartbeat of the war itself. Each engine's vibration seemed to resonate within Jimmy's chest. He imagined the fleet of P-47 Thunderbolts lined up under the moonlight, sleek and lethal, ready to slice through clouds and rain fire on enemy positions. The thought of flying into such inferno made his stomach churn. He thought about his crew, handpicked for this mission. Lieutenant Henry Morales, the quick-witted navigator with a penchant for gambling, Sergeant Leo Whitman, the radio operator who never panicked even when the sky rained bullets, and young Private Billy Harris, barely 18, whose fear masked the steely courage he had shown during training exercises. They trusted him. They would follow him into hell. Jimmy could afford to betray that trust. The briefing had been brutal. MacArthur in person had addressed the small team earlier that afternoon. The general's eyes, sharp and unyielding, had scanned each face with meticulous precision. He did bother with pleasantries. You are going on a mission from which few will return, and some will not return at all. I don't expect you to survive. But if you do, you will have struck a blow that could change the course of this war. The words had sunk into Jimmy like ice water. He remembered the way MacArthur, as hand hovered over the map, tracing lines through enemy territory as if shaping their fates with a pen. The man was legendary, almost mythic, but terrifyingly detached. Jimmy leaned back, letting his head rest against the coarse canvas of the tent. Rain began to patter gently, a steady percussion that mingled with distant thunder. The world outside seemed serene, mocking the chaos that awaited them. He thought of Manila, the city under siege, and the civilians trapped within. The mission was critical. Intelligence suggested that Japanese forces were stockpiling weapons for a counteroffensive that could crush Allied advances in the Pacific. Someone had to stop it. He opened his journal, the leather cover worn from months of travel. The first lines he wrote were shaky, almost illegible. They say, "Don't come back alive. But if I don't go, more lives will be lost." I don't know if this is courage or madness. Time blurred as he wrote, the minutes stretching into hours. The jungle seemed to hold its breath, Somewhere, a troop of monkeys chattered a hollow, eerie sound in the darkness. Jimmy closed his eyes, imagining the skies ahead. They were full of threats: Japanese Zero fighters patrolling, anti-aircraft guns buried in the treetops, and the omnipresent threat of betrayal, miscalculation, or simple bad luck. Each was as lethal as the last. The base was alive with preparation. Mechanics and ground crew worked tirelessly, checking fuel lines, repairing wings, and polishing windshields until the planes gleamed under the wet moonlight. Soldiers moved silently but efficiently, their faces set in masks of determination, resignation, or fear, sometimes all at once. Jimmy walked among them, nodding, offering brief words of encouragement. Inside, his chest tightened with anticipation. Every second brought them closer to the moment of truth. By midnight, the sky was dense with clouds, and the air smelled of wet earth and gasoline. Jimmy and his squadron gathered for a final check. Morales held the navigation charts, Leo ran final diagnostics on the radios, and Billy adjusted the straps on his parachute with trembling fingers. Jimmy studied them, committing every detail of their expressions to memory. These men might not see another sunrise. "Ready, Captain?" Morales asked, his voice steady despite the tension. Jimmy nodded, his own voice catching slightly. "Ready. Let's get this done." They moved toward the runway, engines roaring to life one by one, each machine shaking the earth as if aware of the deadly purpose they were about to serve. The night seemed to thrum with tension. Every sound amplified the hiss of the rain, the clatter of gear, the metallic heartbeat of the planes. As they taxied into position, Jimmy glanced at the moon. It hung low, a pale witness to what they were about to attempt. The runway lights glinted on puddles, each reflection fractured by raindrops. He felt a cold knot of fear, the kind that makes your stomach twist and your hands sweat. This mission was about glory, it was about survival against impossible odds, and yet to disobey MacArthur was unthinkable. To obey might be suicide. The first plane lifted off, wings slicing through the wet night air. Jimmy followed, his P-72 climbing steadily, leaving the familiar earth behind and entering the vast unknown. The jungle below became a blur, a dark sea of shadows punctuated by flickers of enemy fires. Each second brought new danger. Every maneuver carried risk. As they reached cruising altitude, the radio crackled, and Leo's voice broke the tense silence. All systems green. Enemy radar minimal. We were clear for insertion. Jimmy exhaled slowly. For a brief moment he allowed himself a flicker of hope, but then he thought of MacArthur's words, sharp and chilling: "Don't come back alive." They weren't a warning, they were a prophecy. The planes entered enemy airspace, and suddenly the night erupted. Tracer rounds stitched the sky, flak exploded around them, and alarms rang in their ears. Jimmy gritted his teeth, hands firm on the controls, weaving between fire and shadow. The mission had begun in earnest, and there was no turning back. Through the chaos, he thought again of his family, of Tommy, of the fiancé who waited in Manila, of every man and woman whose lives depended on the success of this operation. Somewhere deep within, a fire burned, a determination that he would see the mission through, come what may, even if it meant defying death itself. And in that moment, as the night sky blazed with danger, Jimmy understood something profound. Heroism was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate one's actions. The impossible order from MacArthur was not just a test of skill, it was a crucible of courage, and Jimmy Callahan, for better or worse, would face it head-on. The enemy skies awaited. The mission had begun. The jungle stretched below Jimmy's P-47 like an unbroken green ocean, shadows twisting beneath the canopy as if alive. The hum of the engine was the only thing that kept his mind tethered to reality, each vibration a reminder that life clung to him only by the thinnest thread. He had survived the initial insertion, dodged anti-aircraft fire, and led his squadron through enemy airspace. Yet now, as he peered down at the sprawling Japanese supply depot, The enormity of their task settled like a stone in his chest. Every mission had been preceded by drills, maps, and careful calculation, but nothing could prepare a man for the full, raw chaos of combat. The depot sprawled over several square miles, a labyrinth of warehouses, tanks, and barracks, with soldiers moving like ants under searchlights. Jimmy's orders were clear: recon and sabotage, but in practice, that meant threading the needle between death from above and below. Target in sight. Morales' voice crackled over the radio, calm despite the tension. Flak density increasing. Looks like they expected us. Jimmy gritted his teeth. The first shots of flak tore past his cockpit, metal shredding the air around him with terrifying precision. He jinked left, then right, his fingers white-knuckling the throttle. The other planes in the squadron followed, tracing a deadly choreography between death and survival. Smoke from burning crates rose, mingling with the mist of early morning. Landing was impossible here. The terrain was laced with mines and sharp ridges. Their only chance to complete the mission was to strike from the air, a perilous dance at low altitude that left them exposed to every gun and anti-aircraft position in the depot. Jimmy's heart pounded, but he forced his mind into sharp focus. Hesitation now would mean instant death. Below him, the soldiers and civilians were indistinguishable in the chaos. Jimmy's stomach twisted at the thought of collateral damage, but the mission had no margin for mercy. This was the cruel arithmetic of war. One life saved often meant another lost. He pushed the thought aside. He had a duty, not only to MacArthur's orders, but to the countless lives that hung in the balance. The first bombing run went off with terrifying immediacy. Jimmy's squadron dived through a hail of bullets, bombs dropping with precise devastation. Explosions erupted in brilliant orange flashes, illuminating the jungle canopy as Japanese troops scrambled, terrified and disoriented. Tracer rounds stitched the air, occasionally finding a plane's hull with a sharp clang or a shudder of impact. Jimmy could feel every heartbeat, every breath, in perfect synchrony with the aircraft. For a moment he was no longer a man but a machine. Calculation and instinct fused into a single unit, responding faster than thought itself. A flak shell detonated nearby, rocking the plane violently. Sparks showered the cockpit, smoke curling under the canopy. He fought to keep the nose steady, the controls straining beneath his hands. "Jimmy, we are losing Whitman." Morales' voice cracked with panic. The radio was now a lifeline and a death sentence at the same time. Whitman's plane had taken a direct hit, spiraling toward the treetops. Jimmy had a split second to decide: continue the strike or attempt a rescue. He veered sharply, diving into enemy fire to intercept. The seconds stretched into eternity. Jimmy's plane clipped the edge of a warehouse roof, shrapnel tearing the fuselage. Whitman's craft was tumbling, smoke trailing like a wounded bird. He fired his machine guns in a controlled burst to cover Whitman's descent, guiding the crippled plane with precision. Against all odds, Whitman regained control, his breathing ragged but alive. "Got you," Jimmy muttered, almost to himself, as they maneuvered to escape. There was no time to celebrate. The mission had only just begun. Descending lower, they dropped bombs on the fuel depot, setting it ablaze. The explosion was deafening, shockwaves rippling through the jungle. Trees snapped, crates flew into the air, and the depot's perimeter burned fiercely. Jimmy watched through the haze as Japanese soldiers scattered, screams mingling with the roar of destruction. For a brief, fleeting moment, victory seemed tangible, but it was an illusion. The enemy regrouped quickly. Anti-aircraft fire intensified, bullets tearing through the underbrush and ricocheting past metal hulls. Morales was hit again, this time in the engine, smoke curling violently from the fuselage. Billy Harris's plane veered sharply to avoid a flak burst and collided with a stack of crates on the ground in a blur of sparks. Jimmy knew they would not all make it back. The thought of MacArthur's words echoed in his mind: "Don't come back alive. Now, Fully understanding their meaning, he realized the general had not only issued an order, he had issued a prophecy. To survive this mission meant confronting death with every ounce of resolve. Jimmy made the hardest decision of his life. He would sacrifice his chance to return to ensure the mission's success. He vectored his plane directly toward the enemy's artillery bunker, a nest of guns that had been pounding his squadron relentlessly. His last bombs would take the bunker out, crippling the enemy's ability to retaliate against the main Allied advance. He felt the weight of every man he had trained with, every soldier depending on him. Hold together, he muttered through clenched teeth, releasing his payload. The bombs struck with surgical precision, destroying the bunker in a violent eruption of fire and steel. The jungle shook, enemy soldiers scattered, and the immediate threat to his squadron lifted. But the plane had taken irreparable damage in the process. Smoke filled the cockpit, controls lagged, and the engine sputtered violently. Jimmy gritted his teeth, knowing there was no way back. He radioed Morales, "Get the others out. Save yourselves, I'll hold them off." "Jimmy, don't." Morales's voice cracked before the signal cut off. With a final, steadying breath, Jimmy angled his plane toward the remaining enemy positions, drawing fire away from the retreating squadron. Tracer rounds tore through the air, flak exploding around him. He became a living shield, a single man against an army, embodying every ounce of courage, defiance, and sacrifice he had carried since the mission began. Below, the Japanese troops watched in disbelief as one plane, battered and smoking, continued to dive, evade, and strike. Jimmy's last act was a perfectly timed run that destroyed an additional ammunition cache, denying the enemy the resources to continue their counteroffensive. The final moments were a blur of fire, sound, and motion. The plane erupted in a column of smoke and fire, the impact shaking the earth and scattering debris into the jungle. Jimmy Callahan was gone, his body lost amidst the chaos of war, but his actions had ensured the survival of his squadron and the success of the mission. Back at base, word of the mission spread. Moraes and the surviving men recounted the details with awe and grief. MacArthur, typically detached, was informed of Jimmy's fate. True to the grim efficiency of his command, he ordered a burial at the edge of the base, a simple ceremony under the tropical sun. Soldiers lined the clearing, rifles at attention as the casket was lowered. MacArthur, in his full general's uniform, stood with the weight of the war on his shoulders, eyes solemn but unreadable. No words of comfort were offered, no speeches were made. Yet in the silence, the men felt the gravity of what had been lost and what had been achieved. Jimmy's journal was recovered, filled with sketches, thoughts, and reflections from the mission. His words captured the raw essence of human courage, fear, hope, moral struggle, and the determination to act when every instinct screamed retreat. Soldiers poured over the pages, some crying, some simply staring in silent awe. Over the following years, historians would debate MacArthur's orders. Some saw them as ruthless strategy, others as a calculated test of human endurance and loyalty. But the men who had flown with Jimmy knew the truth. He had not simply obeyed orders, he had redefined them. In the crucible of war, Jimmy Callahan had become more than a soldier, he had become a legend. A small memorial was erected in the Philippines decades later, the sun casting long shadows across the polished stone. Names of all who had fallen that night were etched into the surface, with Jimmy prominently at the center. Descendants and veterans gathered, honoring the sacrifice that had once been whispered about in fear and awe. For those who knew the story, it was clear heroism was not measured by survival, but by the courage to confront impossible odds, to act decisively, and to protect others at any cost. Jimmy Callahan had done all that and more. He had defied death, defied expectation, and in the process changed the course of history. The jungle would reclaim the battlefield, the war would rage on, but the memory of one man, as bravery endured. And as the wind rustled through the trees, carrying faint echoes of engines, bombs, and voices long silenced, it seemed almost as if Jimmy himself was still out there, watching, guiding, and reminding all who would listen. Courage is the choice you make when the world tells you there is none left.